The Whispering Lake. There was a small, quiet lake deep in the countryside, surrounded by thick pine trees that seemed to watch over anyone who dared to visit. Locals rarely went there after sunset, not because of any known danger, but because of the unsettling silence that took over once the sun dipped below the trees. Jake, an experienced fisherman with a love for solitude, decided one weekend to camp there alone. He had heard the stories about the place. People claimed the lake spoke at night, but he dismissed them as local folklore meant to scare kids. Carrying his fishing gear, lantern, and a small tent, Jake arrived just before dusk. The water was glassy and calm, reflecting the fading orange sky like a mirror. He felt a strange mix of peace and unease as he set up his equipment at the edge of the dock that jutted into the still water. As darkness crept in, Jake sat quietly, waiting for a catch. The air was cool, and the faint sound of crickets filled the night. Hours passed without a single bite, but the lake's stillness was almost hypnotic. Then, just as he was about to reel in his line, he heard something, a soft whisper. It was so faint that he thought it might be the wind moving through the trees, but there was no breeze. The voice came again, this time clearer, and it sounded as though it was coming from the middle of the lake. It wasn't words exactly, more like a soft, rhythmic murmur, almost human, but not quite. Jake froze, every muscle in his body tense. He looked out across the dark water, seeing nothing but ripples spreading gently across the surface. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of his mind, maybe the sound of water moving against the rocks. Still, the whispering continued, steady and almost deliberate, as if something beneath the surface was trying to get his attention. Jake stood up, shining his lantern toward the lake's center, and for a split second, he thought he saw movement, a pale shape drifting just under the water before vanishing into the depths. The whispers stopped instantly. The air grew colder, and the forest around him fell completely silent. He decided to pack up for the night, but before he could, the faint sound returned, this time right behind him, close enough that he could feel a chill crawl up his neck. When he turned around, his lantern flickered and the light dimmed, leaving him in near darkness by the Whispering Lake. The lantern in the mist Jake stood completely still, the air around him heavy and unmoving. The faint glow from his lantern flickered weakly, casting long, unsteady shadows across the dock and shimmering faintly on the surface of the water. The whispering had stopped again, replaced by a thick silence that seemed to press against his ears. For the first time that night, Jake felt genuinely uneasy. He wasn't someone who scared easily. He'd spent years fishing in remote rivers and lakes. But something about this place felt wrong, almost as if the quiet itself was alive and watching him. He tried to steady his breathing, telling himself it was only his imagination, that tiredness was playing tricks on his senses. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was close by. Then, as if on cue, a low mist began to roll over the lake's surface, spreading slowly from the far end. Within minutes, the once clear view of the opposite bank was gone, replaced by a soft wall of white fog. Jake could barely see more than a few feet ahead of him. His lantern light was swallowed by the mist, leaving a small circle of visibility that felt suffocatingly small. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the dock's wooden planks beneath his feet, the distant splash of water somewhere out in the fog, and the quiet hum of insects that quickly faded as the mist thickened. Trying to keep calm, Jake decided to pull in his fishing line before heading back to his tent. As he reeled it in, he felt an unexpected resistance, something heavy tugging at the end of the line. At first, he thought it was just caught on a branch, but when he pulled harder, the line moved as if something beneath the water was slowly pulling back. He frowned, gripping the rod tighter. "Probably a big one," he muttered, his voice low and shaky. But then, through the fog, a faint light appeared on the water. Not his lantern's reflection, but a separate, glowing light hovering just above the surface about 20 feet away. It was small, warm, and almost inviting, flickering gently like a candle floating in the mist. Jake squinted, confused. He had never seen anything like it. The light drifted closer, gliding silently over the water, and with each inch it approached, the air grew colder. His breath became visible in the beam of his lantern, and he felt the hair on his arms stand on end. The tug on his fishing line stopped abruptly, leaving the rod slack in his hands. The glowing light paused a few feet from the dock, hovering motionless. Jake leaned forward slightly, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, and for a brief moment, he thought he could make out the faint outline of a face within the glow, featureless but unmistakably human-shaped. Suddenly, the lantern in his hand flickered violently and went out completely, plunging him into darkness. Only the mysterious light on the water remained, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. Then from the fog around him came the whisper again, low, melodic, and closer than ever. It wasn't a language he recognized, but it carried an emotion he could feel deep in his chest. Sadness, or perhaps longing. The sound wrapped around him, drawing him toward the edge of the dock. Against his better judgment, Jake took a slow step forward, his boots echoing faintly on the wood. He felt as though he was being gently pulled, not by force, but by curiosity, a strange, almost dreamlike urge to see what was calling him. But then something snapped him out of it, a sound from behind, sharp and real. It was the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on gravel near his tent. He froze, heart pounding. He wasn't alone anymore. The glowing light on the lake dimmed, as if retreating, and the whispers vanished into the mist once again. The only thing Jake could hear now was the quiet drip of water from his fishing line and the slow, deliberate steps approaching through the darkness behind him. The footsteps by the tent Jake turned slowly toward the sound, every nerve in his body alert. The thick fog that had rolled in from the lake was now creeping across the ground around his campsite, curling between the trees and swallowing the beam of his flashlight. His heart thudded in his chest as he tried to focus his eyes through the shifting mist. He could still hear the faint crunch of footsteps, slow, steady, and deliberate, coming from the direction of his tent. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. The steps paused, then resumed again, circling the small clearing where he had set up camp. For a moment, Jake wondered if another camper had arrived late at night, maybe someone lost or looking for help. But deep down, something about the situation didn't feel right. The way the footsteps moved, measured, rhythmic, and unhurried, made it seem less like a person walking and more like something pacing, waiting. He called out hesitantly, "Hello? Is someone there?" His voice broke the silence, echoing faintly through the trees. There was no response. The footsteps stopped. Jake swallowed hard and gripped his flashlight tighter, forcing himself to take a few cautious steps toward his tent. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and pine, but there was another scent mixed in now, metallic, sharp, and cold. He brushed it off as his nerves, trying to steady his breathing. When he reached his tent, the fog was so dense he could barely see the outline of it. But something immediately caught his attention. The flap of the tent was open. He was certain he had zipped it shut before heading to the dock. Kneeling slowly, Jake lifted the flap and shone the light inside. Everything appeared undisturbed, his sleeping bag, his backpack, his food supplies, all in the same place he had left them. But there was something odd. The ground sheet inside was damp, as though someone had tracked in wet footprints from the lake. He froze as his flashlight beam followed the faint marks, two sets of prints, side by side, leading from the entrance of the tent toward the back wall, and then stopping abruptly. There was no sign of anyone leaving. It was as if whatever had made those prints had simply vanished. The forest seemed to tighten around him, the silence pressing in again. Jake backed away from the tent, glancing toward the lake. The glowing light was gone, but the water was still rippling faintly, as though disturbed by movement beneath the surface. The mist around him grew thicker, swirling and twisting almost deliberately, forming faint shapes that seemed to melt away whenever he tried to focus on them. His instinct screamed at him to leave, but his car was parked half a mile down the trail through the woods, and the fog was now so heavy he could barely see 10 feet ahead. He decided to make a fire. Light always brought him comfort during camping trips, and right now, he needed it more than ever. Gathering some dry wood from his supply, he quickly struck a match and lit a small campfire. The warm orange glow spread through the clearing, pushing back the mist slightly and revealing more of the forest around him. The sight calmed him for a brief moment. He sat down beside the fire, trying to rationalize everything. The whispers, the strange light, the footprints. Maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe he was simply tired and hearing things. But as he stared into the fire, something began to change. The smoke from the flames wasn't rising normally. It was twisting, curling in on itself, forming shapes that almost looked like hands reaching upward. Jake blinked, thinking it was an illusion caused by the fog, but the motion continued, the smoke spiraling upward in a perfect column before spreading out in a ring above the fire. The air grew colder again, and with that cold came a faint, familiar sound. The same whispering voice, now circling the clearing as if moving just beyond the edge of the light. It was no longer soft or distant. It was clear, low, and almost melodic, echoing in patterns that made Jake's stomach knot. He turned his flashlight toward the trees, sweeping the beam back and forth, but nothing was there. Only mist and shadows. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that countless unseen eyes were watching him. Then, just as he was about to stand and move closer to the fire for warmth, the whispering stopped. Total silence fell, heavier than before. And then, from behind him, at the very edge of the firelight, came a sound that made his blood run cold. The gentle sound of water dripping onto dry leaves, one drop at a time. Jake turned his flashlight toward the sound, and what he saw made him stumble backward. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a faint silhouette, human-shaped but completely still. Its outline shimmered faintly, as if the mist itself had gathered into a figure. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. Jake blinked once, twice, and when his flashlight flickered back on, the shape was gone. The only thing left was a small trail of wet footprints leading back toward the lake. The trail back to the water for several long moments. Jake stood frozen beside the fire, unable to move. The quiet clearing seemed to hold its breath with him, and the only sound was the faint crackle of burning wood. His flashlight beam trembled in his hand as he stared at the trail of wet footprints leading away into the fog. They were spaced evenly, as though made by someone calmly walking barefoot. Not rushing, not stumbling, simply moving with purpose toward the lake. The prints glistened faintly in the firelight, reflecting a silvery sheen that didn't quite look like ordinary water. Something about them felt unnatural, as if the lake itself had left its mark. Jake's first instinct was to stay put. Every rational thought in his head screamed that following those prints would be a terrible idea. But at the same time, an inexplicable pull drew him toward the lake. The same strange curiosity that had made him listen to the whispers earlier. He had to know what was happening. He had to see for himself. So, against all sense of caution, he grabbed his lantern, took a deep breath, and began to follow the trail. The forest was eerily silent as he moved. The mist muffled his footsteps, and the glow of the campfire faded behind him until it was swallowed completely by the fog. The footprints glowed faintly under the lantern's light, guiding him along a narrow path lined with wet leaves and twisted roots. Every few steps, he paused, listening. There was no wind, no rustle of animals, nothing but his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. He tried to convince himself he was just following the marks of some animal or an odd trick of condensation. But deep down he knew better. These prints were deliberate, almost too perfect, as though they were leading him somewhere. After several minutes of walking, the trees began to thin out, revealing the lake ahead. The mist was thicker near the water, curling low over the surface like a living thing. The moon, hidden behind a veil of clouds, cast a faint silver light that shimmered through the fog. The air smelled heavier here, damp and cold, with that same faint metallic edge. As Jake approached the shoreline, the footprints ended right at the water's edge, disappearing into the shallows. He lifted his lantern higher, trying to see beyond the mist, but the water reflected nothing but a dull, shifting gray. Then, without warning, a soft sound broke the silence, the gentle splash of something moving just beneath the surface. Jake's breath caught. The ripples spread outward in a slow, circular pattern, and in their center, the faint glow returned. The same small, flickering light he had seen earlier that night. It hovered just above the water, steady this time, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. The whispering began again, faint but unmistakable, carrying across the water in a rhythmic murmur. It didn't sound threatening now. It sounded sorrowful, almost pleading. Jake felt his fear slowly give way to fascination. The sound wasn't in his head. It was real, alive, and it was calling to him. He took a cautious step closer to the water's edge, the muddy ground sinking beneath his boots. The whispering grew clearer, forming patterns, though he couldn't make out actual words. His lantern flickered as he leaned closer, and he saw something move beneath the surface. A shape, pale and indistinct, gliding just under the water like a shadow. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, replaced by the soft lapping of waves against the shore. The glowing light on the lake began to move backward, slowly retreating farther out, as though beckoning him to follow. Jake hesitated, torn between the instinct to run and the deep, irrational urge to step forward. The mist swirled around his legs, cold and damp, clinging to him like invisible fingers. He took another step, the water now brushing against his boots. Then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. New footprints appearing beside his own. They emerged one by one in the wet sand, pressing down into the earth as though an unseen figure was walking right next to him. He stumbled backward, his lantern swinging wildly. The light illuminated the ground for a split second, and he could clearly see them. A second set of prints forming beside his, each one sinking deeper than the last. The air grew colder still, and a soft breath, warm and near, brushed past his ear. Jake spun around, shining the lantern behind him, but there was nothing, just a fog, thick and impenetrable. He turned back toward the lake, and the glowing light had vanished once again. The water was still, perfectly calm, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. The footprints, too, began to fade, the edges softening until they melted into the damp soil. The only sign that anything had happened was the silence, that deep, unnatural silence that made the forest feel almost hollow. Shaken, Jake slowly backed away from the water and turned toward the path leading back to his camp. But something was different now. The trail behind him, the one he had followed so carefully, was gone. The fog had swallowed everything, the trees, the ground, even the faint orange glow of his campfire. It was as though the world itself had shifted while he wasn't looking. Panic rose in his chest as he spun in slow circles, trying to find any landmark, any direction that would lead him back. But there was nothing, only the endless mist, and somewhere in that mist, the soft, rhythmic sound of water droplets falling, one by one, like a heartbeat in the dark. The echo beneath the lake the mist had closed in so tightly that Jake could barely see his own hands. Each breath came out in pale clouds, hanging in the cold air before fading into the fog. He turned slowly, his lantern trembling in his grasp, trying to make sense of his surroundings. Every direction looked the same, endless gray, silent and shapeless. His heart pounded harder with every passing second. He had been in wilderness before, but this was different. This was not the kind of loss that came from bad navigation. It felt as if the forest itself had shifted around him, like it no longer wanted him to find his way out. He began to walk, choosing a direction at random, hoping to retrace his steps. The ground beneath him was damp and soft, and the air grew even colder as he moved. He tried calling out, shouting his own name just to hear a sound, anything to break the heavy quiet. But his voice came back to him in strange ways. It didn't echo normally. It stretched and warped, repeating in tones that didn't sound like his own. It was as if the fog itself was speaking back, mimicking his voice, but slower, softer, almost like someone whispering from underwater. That eerie repetition made him stop in his tracks. For a moment, he listened carefully, and then, unmistakably, his own voice whispered back a few words he hadn't said. "Come closer." A chill ran down his spine. He spun around, shining his lantern toward where the sound had come from. The light cut through the fog only a few feet before it was swallowed by the gray. Nothing moved, yet the feeling of being watched returned, heavy and focused, as though dozens of unseen eyes were fixed on him. He tried to tell himself he was imagining it, but then, far ahead, the fog seemed to thin slightly, revealing the faint outline of the lake once again. The water was calm, but it shimmered faintly with that same pale, silvery glow he had seen before. Something about it drew him forward again. Against all reason, he stepped toward the shore. When he reached the edge, he realized the lake was no longer silent. A low humming sound vibrated through the air, deep and rhythmic, almost musical. It seemed to come from beneath the surface, as if the entire body of water was resonating with some kind of hidden energy. Jake crouched down, bringing the lantern closer to the water, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. Beneath the surface, just a few feet deep, something was moving. The light revealed faint shapes, hundreds of them, drifting slowly in the water like shadows. They weren't fish. They were too still, too human-like in form. The humming grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath him. Ripples began to spread across the surface, and he could see faces now, faint, pale faces beneath the rippling water, eyes closed as if sleeping. They moved gently with the current, suspended in the darkness below. Jake stumbled backward in shock, nearly dropping the lantern. The moment he moved, several of the faces seemed to stir, their eyes slowly opening. He froze. The water glowed faintly brighter, and with it came the whispering. Not one voice now, but many, blending together in a haunting harmony that filled the air. It was neither loud nor aggressive. It was calm, almost soothing, but it carried a deep sadness that felt ancient, older than the forest itself. Jake couldn't look away. The voices seemed to weave around his thoughts, pulling at him with invisible threads of emotion. Sorrow, loneliness, longing. The shapes beneath the water began to rise slowly, their forms clearer now. Figures dressed in tattered, colorless clothing, their outlines soft and almost translucent. They hovered just below the surface, looking up at him as though waiting for something. The humming changed, deepening into a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Jake took one involuntary step forward, his boots sinking into the wet mud. Then, out of nowhere, a single voice separated from the others, soft, female, and close, as though someone was standing directly beside him. "You heard us," it whispered. Jake spun toward the sound, but no one was there. The voice came again, clearer this time, from the direction of the water. "You stayed when others left." The lantern's light flickered violently, the flame shrinking and then swelling again. The surface of the lake rippled outward, and something broke through, a pale hand reaching upward just enough to touch the air before sinking back down. Panic surged through Jake. He stumbled backward, his lantern swinging wildly, splashing droplets of water across his boots. The whispering grew louder now, no longer calm, but insistent, overlapping voices that blurred together into something almost like a chant. The water rippled more violently, and shapes began to rise again, closer to the surface this time. It looked as though the lake itself was exhaling, pushing something out from its depths. The glow beneath the water pulsed with every whisper, brighter, stronger, until the entire shoreline shimmered with pale light. Jake turned and ran. His boots slipped on the wet ground, but adrenaline drove him forward. He didn't care where he was going. He just wanted to get away from the water. The fog pressed against him from every side, thick as smoke. He couldn't see the trees anymore, only flashes of faint movement in the mist, as though the air itself was alive. He thought he heard footsteps behind him again, fast, light, and following in perfect rhythm with his own. The whispers chased him too, circling around him in waves. "Don't go! Not yet. You came for us." He finally burst into what looked like an open clearing, gasping for breath. His heart raced as he looked around, disoriented. The fog had thinned slightly here, enough for him to see a shape ahead, the outline of a small wooden dock. His dock. Somehow, impossibly, he was back where he started. The lantern in his hand flickered weakly, almost out of oil, and the silence returned once again. The lake lay before him, calm and undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. But the moment he looked down at the dock surface, his blood ran cold. There were wet footprints there, fresh and glistening, leading from the edge of the dock straight toward where he now stood. The depths of the whispering lake. Jake stood at the edge of the dock, his entire body trembling as the lantern's fading flame sputtered weakly against the cold wind. The fresh footprints glistened faintly in front of him, reflecting the dim light like wet glass. They stopped just a few feet ahead, at the very edge of the dock, and then simply ended, vanishing into the water. The lake itself was still again, calm and mirror-smooth, as if nothing had stirred it in centuries. Yet beneath that calm, Jake could feel a low vibration. Not a sound exactly, but a deep hum that seemed to travel through the air and into his bones. He sensed it coming from below the surface, like the echo of something vast and waiting. For a long moment, he didn't move. Every instinct he had told him to turn and run into the forest, to escape while he still could. But another part of him, the same curious, stubborn part that had brought him to this lake in the first place, urged him to stay. He needed to understand what was happening. He needed to know why this place felt alive. Slowly, he crouched at the edge of the dock, holding the lantern over the water. The faint orange light rippled across the surface, revealing only darkness below. Then, as if in response to his movement, the water began to shimmer again, faint rings spreading outward, followed by a soft, rhythmic whisper that returned from the depths. This time, the voice wasn't scattered or distorted. It was clear. "You hear us," it said softly, almost gently. "You stayed." The sound wasn't frightening. It carried a tone of melancholy that drew him closer, as though the lake itself was speaking through a veil of grief. Jake leaned forward, peering into the water. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw faces again, faint outlines moving slowly beneath the surface, but they looked different now. Not threatening, not angry. Sad. Their expressions were calm, almost peaceful, and their eyes seemed to follow him, filled with something like longing. Then, one of the figures drifted upward, closer to the surface than before. Jake could see it clearly now. The translucent image of a person, featureless yet unmistakably human, suspended in the glowing water. The voice came again, not one voice now, but many, rising and falling like a tide. "We were heard once," they whispered. "We waited to be found." Jake's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" he managed to say, his voice breaking slightly. The water rippled in answer, and the reflection of his own face shimmered for a moment before fading into the image of another. Pale, unfamiliar, yet eerily calm. The whispers continued, overlapping softly like waves. "The lake remembers," they said. "Every sound, every life, every step." Jake tried to step back, but his foot slipped on the damp wood. He steadied himself, gripping the dock's edge, his heart pounding. "What do you want?" he whispered into the fog. The answer came slowly, each word spaced with haunting precision. To be known, to be seen again, to be heard. The lake seemed to pulse in rhythm with the words, its glow deepening as the mist above it began to move in slow, swirling patterns. For a brief moment, Jake's fear faded. He felt an unexpected calm wash over him, as if the air itself was holding him steady. The voices didn't sound dangerous. They sounded lonely, desperate for acknowledgement. He began to understand that what haunted the lake wasn't anger or malice. It was sorrow. The kind that lingers when something or someone is forgotten for too long. The idea filled him with both awe and sadness. Maybe the whispering lake wasn't cursed as people claimed. Maybe it was simply alive with memories, echoes of those who had come before and never left. But then, something shifted. The calm water suddenly trembled, and the voices changed. The soft, sorrowful tone broke apart, replaced by urgent whispers that rose and fell too quickly to follow. The glow beneath the surface brightened until it was almost blinding, and a cold wind whipped across the lake, scattering the mist into wild spirals. Jake stepped backward, shielding his face, but the sound grew louder, not angry, but pleading. "Don't go," the voices cried together, layered and echoing from every direction. "Stay, please stay," the dock groaned under his weight, the old wood creaking as the vibrations from the lake grew stronger. Jake stumbled, nearly dropping the lantern. It swung from his hand, the light flaring and dimming with each movement. When he looked down again, he saw that the shapes beneath the water were rising. Hundreds of them, their outlines forming a vast circle that stretched out from the center of the lake. The glow from below turned the water a pale, ghostly blue, illuminating the mist from underneath. For a moment, it was beautiful, breathtaking even. The entire lake pulsed like a living heart. Then the humming stopped. Absolute silence. The water went still again, the light fading until it was gone completely. Jake stood there, breathing hard, his lantern flickering weakly. Nothing moved. The voices were gone. The mist was beginning to thin, revealing faint outlines of trees again. It was as if the lake had gone back to sleep. Slowly, shakily, Jake stepped away from the edge of the dock. He turned toward the path that led into the forest. This time, it was visible again, the faint orange glow of his dying campfire flickering somewhere beyond the trees. He didn't look back as he made his way toward it. The whispers never returned, and the mist gradually lifted as dawn approached. When he finally reached his car hours later, the sun was rising, spilling golden light over the lake. It looked calm and harmless in daylight, a perfect mirror reflecting the sky. If anyone had come by then, they would have seen nothing unusual at all. But as Jake stood there one last time, looking out across the water, he thought he heard something faint, a single whisper carried on the breeze, soft and distant. "You heard us." Jake never spoke about that night to anyone. But from that day forward, whenever he passed a lake, no matter how calm or peaceful, he always paused to listen, because deep down, he knew that some waters remember. Some lakes whisper not out of malice, but out of memory. And though he had escaped the whispering lake, a part of him would always carry its echo, faint, endless, and waiting to be heard again.